At this point, we've asked Howard Edelman, who I think everyone here is familiar with. Howard is Professor Emeritus here at York University, but he is the founder of so many different movements in the field of refugee and forced migration that I'm sure many of you are familiar with. He's the founder of Operation Lifeline, founder of the Center for Refugee Studies. He's the author of The Standard History of Canada's Response to the Indo-Chinese Refugee Crisis. And we have one authority interviewing another authority. And the other authority is, of course, the practitioner, the person on the governmental side, Mike Malloy, who we're all familiar with and who's given us the history prior to 1975. So we are now going to hear from Howard and Mike talk about these operational and legislative innovations.
Thanks very much, James. We're going to run this as a question and answer. Is this working? As a question-answer session. I'll begin the questioning, and Mike will do all the answering. And then we'll open it up to the audience, because there's a lot of excellence and experience in the audience, and they'll be able to correct both of us as experts. Let me begin where Mike ended off this morning, to ask Mike to put the whole thing in the context. He ended up talking about the legislation and the political leadership, but I wonder if now he would evaluate the legislation, what was good and bad in it, evaluate the political leadership, and thirdly, and most importantly, introduce what I think is the third key element, which was the administrative expertise that got developed in the department.
Okay, thank you, Howard. I promise this is the last time you're going to hear from me. Starting perhaps with at the political level, I think it's really important to look at the fact that from 75 to 80, Canada had a liberal government, a conservative government, and another liberal government. There was on the refugee front, there was amazing amount of continuity. We had four really strong ministers, one after the other. Starts with Robert Andrus, who, as I said this morning, was so taken with the the first part of the Indo-Chinese problem, that he actually went down into the bowels of the immigration department and stayed with them while they were setting it up and getting it going. It's followed by Bud Cullen, who actually was the one who brought the 76 Immigration Act into fruition. He supervised the actual implementation. And Bud was the one who was responsible for the decision on the Hai Hong and for going to cabinet and saying, you know, we got to start planning our refugee intake, and we need a big chunk this coming year. I want half of our quota applied to Indochina. Then we get Mr. Ron Atke coming in with the Conservative government with the strong support of Flora MacDonald, who was the foreign minister, taking that incredible decision. You know, after years and years of programs that, you know, 1,000 of this and 5,000 of that and 7,000 of something else, they come up with a program to bring in 50,000 people. That took a lot of guts at a time. You know, we were only about a decade and a half into the idea of open immigration to go before the public and say we're going to bring 50,000 people from a place far, far away that we've only heard of in a war context. Took a heck of a lot of political courage. And then we followed up about nine months later with Lloyd Axworthy. And as we all know, Lloyd's main interest in immigration had to do with the refugee issue. So that was a very, very strong a strong team, and despite the differences in personalities and in political philosophy, we in the bureaucracy felt a lot of continuity and shared vision of things. In terms of the legislation, as I mentioned briefly before, there were three important things that there was a lot about refugees in it. I mean, the convention refugees were privileged, put on the same status in some instances as Canadian citizens. Their admission to Canada was a major objective of the act, and so when it came time to design the selection system for the convention refugee class that we were bringing in from overseas, it was very easy for us to persuade the government that we were going to take the numbers out of the point system, and that it wouldn't look that there would be a distinct way of selecting people. The other important element, the second important element of that was this notion of the designated classes, and maybe I should talk about that a little bit. The convention refugee is the gold standard. But to determine whether somebody's a convention refugee is not a trivial business. You have to establish that they have a well-founded fear of persecution, that fear is reasonable. I don't want to go much more deeper than that. So in a tribunal, when people arrive in Canada, you have the resources of the tribunal. When you're dealing with selection of refugees abroad, you don't have a tribunal and you don't have all that legal apparatus, but often you're sitting in the middle of a refugee camp doing your interviews, so you have certain clues as to whether or not these people are refugees or not. But it does take time. It does take time in an interview to actually come to the point where we're going to protect this person against removal from Canada come hell or high water. So you've got to get it right. And we had enough experience in the recent refugee movements, particularly the ones in Kampala and in Santiago, to know that if you wanted to move quickly, you needed a more targeted definition. And so when we realized, I guess late 77, early 78, that we really were going to be moving big numbers, the notion of somebody sitting on the beach as people got off the boat and saying to one, do you have a well-founded fear of persecution? Do you have it's pretty obvious, as we heard from this morning. These people were, whatever they were running away from was pretty damn serious. So we thought, okay, let's just frame a definition that says people from these countries who have fled after this date, have not been accepted by any other country, and would like to come to us, that's our target. And that allowed the visa officers what it essentially meant was the government had taken on its shoulders the responsibility for saying these people are eligible to be treated as refugees, kind of a blanket presumption. And that really helped we'll hear later, I suppose, but the Australians and the Americans didn't do that, and their processes accordingly were much more cumbersome than ours, believe it or not. So that's the second piece. And the last piece of that one is the sponsorship program. And we had, when we were designing it, we had refugees coming in from Europe, we had refugees coming in from South America, we had this trickle coming in from Southeast Asia. And we had no real notion that, and to be very blunt, the main refugee advocate groups, organizations in the country were very suspicious of the sponsorship program, and they probably had some right to be so, because they assumed that this meant the government was going to offload the whole business of refugee resettlement on the churches and others. And there were probably a few people in the immigration department who had that on the agenda, although, in fact, that's not the way it played out. So that when we were thinking about it, we were thinking of a highly transactional thing where it might start with a visa officer spotting someone. It might start with a church having a name. It might start and so you had to design a program where the information went this way, and then it went that way, then it went this way, and then it went that way. And it was all based on the notion that the refugees were sitting warm and dry in a comfortable camp in Austria, okay? It became pretty clear that was, once we began to see what was coming at us, that kind of a process wouldn't work. And it was the other thing about the system was that from what we needed, the determination of who would be sponsored and what sponsors would be accepted was in the wrong place. It was in the visa offices overseas, where they didn't have any particular expertise. And when we got into dealing with the Indo-Chinese refugees, they were very busy with other things. And it was in the wrong place in the process, because the names were forwarded before the refugee was finished their formalities. And in the early days, at the early months even of 79 and 80, and even into 80, there were no controls on who was seeing which refugees. So you could send a name to a group in Canada saying, this is the right one, so they'd have their bake sales and raise the money. By the time you were ready to move that person, they might find they'd gone to Australia, or they might have been snapped up by the Americans. And so you have to go and tell the families in Canada, oops, too bad, we lost that one, how'd you like another? So as I said, the decision was being placed in the wrong place, and putting the refugees into the sponsorship stream was in the wrong place. And it took us a while to sort through that. And it was in fact, the matching center that was supposed to do this was set up in May. By July, we were getting between 8,000 and 5,000 new refugees being sponsored every month. And so, as I said to Howard the other day, we had designed a kind of a garden hose approach. We needed a fire hose. And so we brought in a really interesting colleague of ours by the name of Ian Thompson. And Ian was and is an original person. And we stuck him in the matching center for a week, and he came to me one Friday afternoon. And Ian, if you can imagine Teddy Roosevelt, but 4 times bigger, okay? And he comes in and plops himself down in my desk, and he says, "Listen, Malloy, are you interested in moving information, or do you want to move refugees? Because you can't do both." And so I said, "I think we want to move refugees." And so he completely flipped the system over. And how it worked was then, when that refugee was ready to move, we selected him, we got to the medicals, the security, the Australians hadn't poached him or her, and they were sitting in the transit camp with a flight known. At that stage, the visa office would send these incredibly long messages saying, here's who's coming. And it's at that stage we'd be able to tell a refugee family, they're on a flight coming on this date, will you take them? And so and all we needed to make the thing work perfectly, or at least as perfectly as we could, given the numbers and the time, was then to get a computer that would allow us to track the incoming sponsors, track the incoming refugees. Once we got that in place, we could really move it along. And it was never perfect, but by the time we got, I think, and partly wasn't perfect because these fellas did their work too well. You know, by the time we got to September, we had more refugees sponsored than the allocation that had been given of 21,000. And if we just followed straight along, we'd have ended up having to put about 50 more officers in the field and open up a third transit center in Canada. So you know, we always had a problem with volumes. We never actually were able to solve that. They could only solve that with time. But that machinery really made a big difference once we got it. But we had to do it on the run. It wasn't as if we were sitting down thinking, well, someday we're going to take a lot of, you know, we're going to be bringing in 3,000 refugees a month, and so we'll design a system for that now. No, they were already coming when we were redesigning. It was a bit like rearranging the cars on a train rushing down the track, you know. It's tricky. You can do it, but it's tricky. And we finally got it. Final point, can I talk about the people?
Yes, certainly can.
Okay. At that stage, the Canadian Immigration Service was about as capable as any institution of government has ever been, and I'll tell you why. On the overseas side, in the Immigration Foreign Service, we had been recruiting people to Foreign Service officer standards since '58. So we had a 20-year cohort of people who were university educated, spent a lot of time abroad, vast experience. And while our people were recruited the same way as say, Foreign Affairs Foreign Service officers, the work experience brought something different out of them. They could make decisions. They could assess situations rapidly. You had to be able to do that. And you couldn't last very long in that service if you couldn't manage things. So we had groups of people that really understood how to make things happen. When Murray Opelshauser, who you're going to meet in the next one, was sent off to Bangkok to set up an operation that was going to move 18,000 people on his watch, there was no book we could give him to show him, oh, this is how you do it, Murray. First you do this thing. He had to figure it out. When we went to the managers in Quebec and in Alberta and said, we'd like you to set up a facility that can absorb up to 3 747s a week and move them, clean them up, do their final processing, orient them, give them proper clothing, give them a chance to rest, make sure they're all well before we send them off. There was no book. And yet, within 3 weeks of the orders being given, there they were. So we had a really talented group of colleagues and real depth. And that's what made it. People could be sent off to Bangkok or Malaysia, and with almost no orientation, they just knew what. If they didn't know what to do, they figured it out. And I think that we had some real talent on both the domestic and international sides of the department that allowed the policies to be implemented as well as could be done. That's a short answer.
I'd like to summarize it and refer to something. You had the right legislation in place. You had an apolitical political leadership. And Ron Atke, who's here, the Honorable Ron Atke, who will be on the panel tomorrow. Why don't you stand up, Ron, because you deserve to. People don't all know you. Ron told me a story this week that when he came into office and the Conservatives replaced the Liberals, he went up to the Immigration Department and there was Bud Cullen packing up the office. And Bud Cullen was a friend. They were in different parties, but Bud said, let me tell you what the score is, and briefed them very much on the Indo-Chinese refugee situation. That makes a tremendous difference. The quality of leadership, the cooperation among leadership, whatever the political parties, the legislation, and the administration quality that Michael just said. Mike is dead right. If you don't implement it right, the whole thing falls apart, as we know from Obamacare. That you need to have the skills in the system and a quality civil service. And if you don't, you start running down the civil service, you can't implement the best programs you want to. I want to go on to another question now, which is another dimension of which we'll have a whole panel on, which is you had to have a communications skills too, because this isn't just deciding among yourselves. You're dealing with the civil society now, you're dealing with the media that help foster the whole thing, as well as ready to pounce on you if you ever made a mistake. What kind of communication strategy had you developed?
Well, we had, as our deputy minister at that time, a guy by the name of Jack Mannion, who was one of the great mandarins that came up through the Canadian system. And handily for us, Jack had been, as a very junior officer, had done for the Hungarians what they asked me to do for the Indo-Chinese. He'd run that program from Ottawa. So he had more than a few clues, but he understood right away that when he was setting up the structure, he wanted a dedicated communications unit. And we picked a fellow by the name of Rennie Papone to lead it. Rennie is the historian of the Hai Hong movement, very capable communications officer, very experienced at that stage, very creative, and desperately wanted to be with us today, but he's not in good enough health. And so they created a news desk so that newspapers, TV, and what could get information on what was going on 24 hours a day. There was always somebody there. Second thing, a really important thing, and I believe Rennie attributes this to Mr. Atke, was they decided that, you can get a lot of information out through the media, but they'll lose interest and then they'll come back and they'll lose interest and come back. And so we, at the minister's request, and of course this is in the pre-email, pre-cell phone, pre-everything days, decided that that the minister would issue a newsletter initially once a week. And eventually, we had eventually had a circulation of 14,000 copies a week going out. And what that meant was that the minister could provide information directly to the sponsors, to the operation lifelines of the country, whatnot. What the heck is going on this week? Always with the numbers, the latest news from Bangkok, the latest news from Hong Kong. And we were also able to, as the Americans and different parts of Canada, people were developing, for example, counseling kits or linguistic kits or that sort of thing. We could make that available or tell people where to find that stuff. And so, and that ran for almost a year, and it was a really powerful and useful tool. And as issues came up, like eventually, you get a lot of people in the country, you begin to get medical scares. Well, what do these people have? We were able to get people like Dr. Jay Keystone, the Canada's premier tropical medicine expert, to write an issue for us and describe what was coming, and the simple message at the end of the day: dear sponsors, when they arrive with you, within a week or two, hook them up with the doctor in your parish, and anything that's going to come at us from that point of view, as long as there's a doctor who knows they're there, we're going to be able to deal with it. Then we issued a whole series of tools for sponsors, speaking kits for our own people. The pictures up on the wall there come from a package that Rennie put together so that every manager of every immigration office and every employment office in the country had 50 photos of what the camps look like and what the reception centers in Edmonton and Montreal look like. We did all those sorts of things. We even put together the great story about the language guide. We thought we should put out in the script of Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos a special edition with useful phrases and things so that the people coming in who didn't necessarily speak English or French could go through it and say, how do I use the bathroom in whatever language. And the great story about it is they couldn't find. There was no printing press in Canada that could print Laotian script. So they had to find somebody to write it. And they were putting it together, getting ready to send it out to the press, and somebody just happened to notice that half the pages were upside down, because Canadians looking at it didn't know. But the thing was, right from the start, the really important thing about why this is all important is, for the first time, we were dealing with not only other levels of government and our own bureaucracy. We had 7,000 stakeholders out there in the persons of the sponsoring groups, and getting the messages and information to them as fast as we could, as fast as we got it, was really important. So the communication strategy was central, and it was actually the first thing that got stood up. And they realized right from the start. And it would always begin with, Minister Ron Atke today announced. Minister Ron Atke wants you to know. And by the way, 14,000 copies going out every week for almost a year. Try and find one today. But Rennie Papone, God bless him, kept a full set, and they will end up on the York website before too much time is up. They are a treasure trove of information. You can track the first year of the program for those things and what was happening and where the problems were.
You talked about the communication strategy dealing with the backlash and health problems and Jay Keystone's role. By the way, I think Jay should always have gotten an Order of Canada, because he was just terrific. I mean, he set up the tropical unit at the General Hospital, and the information he gave to all the refugee sponsors changed their whole fears, because they all had fears about getting TB or hepatitis or something.
Can you move the microphone closer to his mouth?
Yeah, sure. Sorry about that. So Jay Keystone was magical, but I wonder if you would talk about the communication strategy in dealing with the political backlash, because we're not talking about political party backlash, but the National Citizens Coalition in particular.
Yeah. We had sort of three waves of attacks. The first and most serious one was when the National Citizens Coalition took out a series of full-page ads And their main message was every one of these 50,000 people is going to turn around and sponsor 15 other people, and therefore, dear Canadians, you're on the hook for 750,000 people coming in. And won't that be a terrible thing? Well, their math was really bad. And I think that so having a unit that could counter that kind of argumentation was really important. Having the minister and ministers going out, but the best part of the strategy was having the Operation Lifelines and Project 4000, where you had respected, legitimate community leaders that we could provide information to counter those kinds of argumentations. The second wave was a medical scare, and Keystone helped us deal with that. The third wave was, there's thousands of criminals in this group. And again, we were able to use the network to get stories out. The most effective thing that we did with the National Citizens Coalition attack was that we got a story from Hong Kong during the first wave of flights out of Hong Kong. And the story was like this. The Health Canada and agriculture people really got kind of twitchy when the first flight of refugees arrived, and the people had, smoked chickens and various other things in their luggage. And so the word went out, this was not to happen, and even more so, you've got to be worried that when refugees arrive, you've got to take away their undies and burn them and all these sorts of things. So anyways, they're loading one of the flights out of Hong Kong, and a family comes down, and they keep calling a little girl who's sort of trailing them, and they're getting onto the plane, and this little girl is about this tall, and she's carrying a huge plastic bucket with two hands coming down the gangway towards the airplane. And of course, the customs people there who were checking for contraband food were about to pounce on her when the late Colleen Couples, a very, very capable colleague of ours who was running the show for refugees at that moment in Hong Kong, grabs an interpreter and rushes up and sort of heads off the customs people, and they sort of squat down in front of the little girl and say, well, can you open up the bucket? And so they take the string off and they look in the bucket, and it's full of water. So Colleen asked the interpreter, well, why is she bringing the water? And it's a story like we heard this morning. The little girl says, we were on a boat for days and days and days, and there was no water. My mama tells me we're going on a long trip, and I'm not going to be thirsty this time. We put that story out through the newsletter, and that was read in church basements and all sorts of other things across the country. And a lot of nasty people crawled back under their rocks when they heard that one. The trick in so much of this was to personalize the refugees. Instead of trying to defend, there's this and this and this, these massive people, zero in on the individual. Because Canadians get twitchy about large groups, they always sympathize with the individual. And so the strategy was to sort of personalize that these are human beings we're talking to, and here's one, and here's his wife, and here's his family, or here's this little girl. And personalizing it helped, cut off this nameless fear that was out there.
You talked about her getting on this long flight. I don't think when we were dealing with the sponsors and helping them understand, we ever communicated adequately the difficulties, the logistic difficulties of arranging flights, especially since all the DC-9s in the world have been grounded.
Yes.
Can you describe the logistic problems you had in landing 3 huge planes a week in staging areas, et cetera?
Well, initially, of course, the government Mr. Atke and his friends having made the decision, they wanted to see action today, or preferably yesterday. And as Howard said, all the DC-10s, which were the workhorses of the airlines in those days, had been grounded because of an accident somewhere. And of course, it's the middle of summer. Air Canada, CP Air, all the other, they didn't have planes sitting around doing nothing in the middle of tourist season in Canada. It was hard to get airplanes. So the first thing we did was we went to the most expensive airline in the world, the Royal Canadian Air Force, and got them to give us 11 flights. And they were to go between the 27th of July and the 29th of August. Now at that stage, The crew in Bangkok consisted of 2 officers, and the crew in Singapore was 3, I think. And so we knew we couldn't throw those flights at them. But we had a big office in Hong Kong. And we thought, well, our boys and girls in Hong Kong, we're going to make them sweat. So we sent them a message saying, 2 weeks from now, you're going to be getting a 707 every 3.5 days. And empty seats are not allowed. So they went out and they did it. They went out and found us 11 planes full of refugees. And it was at that stage we learned a lot. We learned more about airlines than we ever wanted to know. In that part of the world, yeah, if you're loading up a full airplane with people in it, even if they're not really big people, you have to be up in the air before the sun comes up, because once that tropical heat hits the air, it expands, it gets thinner, and it gets harder and harder for the airplanes to get lift. So one of the things, the great joys that our colleagues had to face was going out, at before midnight, supervising the loading of a plane with the great cooperation of IOM, seeing the plane off at, say, 3 o'clock in the morning, going back to go to bed, and having people like Mr. Obertshauser over there saying, what do you mean you're not going to be in the office at 7 o'clock tomorrow morning? So it was really quite good. But at the end of the day, 181 flights. And as it went on, more and more 747s. So you could pack 500 people onto a 747. And the staging area, for example, the one in Griesbach, developed the capacity that if we ever had an epidemic, they could take an entire 747 full of refugees, quarantine it, pass another one right through it, and never have the 2 groups meet. That was the kind of capacity that we had. The reality was that every one of those posts was probably loading 2, sometimes 3 planes a week. And in Singapore, they had to fly them out of Kuala Lumpur and Singapore. So, and the whole time I found the list of the officers we had out there at the final stages of the movement, whenever we were going all great guns. There were never 20 officers in all doing this. Typically, there would be 15 working in all those posts, delivering up 60,000 refugees after 2 years. So it's a Herculean task.
Well, Ron told me another story about the, not so much the plane side of it, but the staging area side of it, which was, it was very important to bring the Defense Department on board supporting refugees. And they're having a place in the game and being able to get credit because they weren't, as you've said, not very busy at that time doing defense work to help the refugees land and organize all that part of it. I want to ask one more question, and we'll open it up to the audience, which is about the resettlement side, because it's getting them, selecting them, transporting them, all those problems you have. When we get here, you have to meet people and you have to give them coats. And you heard the description this morning. Somebody lands in Montreal in minus 30-degree weather with a cotton short sleeve shirt on.
Pair of flip-flops.
Yeah. Give us an idea of the work done on the resettlement side with the provinces, with the municipalities, with the civil society.
Okay. Well, it started really at the reception centers, where the people were allowed to rest for a few days, get their formalities completed, be issued clothing, and the ones that landed in Edmonton were lucky, not because it was so cold, but because Ward Air was there, and the head of Ward Air really loved the refugee movement, and we had a hangar to unload the people in, so it wasn't quite as bad. But so as the people arrived, those for whom sponsors had been found were directed to the communities where the sponsors were. But they were all issued clothing appropriate to the season before they got there at the center. The rest that we couldn't find sponsors for in the time allocated were sent out to communities, and they were met by counselors from what used to be called the Canada Employment Centers. And there were people in those employment centers who specialized in receiving refugees. Now, there were a gazillion problems that came up as we went along. One of the problems was that while we had what used to be called the ISAP program, the Immigrant Settlement Assistance Program, where you could fund agencies that helped newcomers, including refugees, there was no machinery out there at all to support sponsor group. There was no money to pay the administrative costs, for example, of local chapters of groups that were brought together to coordinate what was going on in the community. So one of the things that we did in sort of around the end of 1979, beginning of 80, was that the government gave us an extra $1.5 million. We put some of it into the ISAP agency so they could bulk up, and we made money available to the sponsoring coordination groups to cover their administrative costs. And we put about, I think, $750,000 into that. I don't know if we sent any to you guys because you were in Toronto, but everywhere else they got money. And so that and the other thing that we did, which was really really very useful, was that we created a corps of what were called refugee liaison officers, and there's one here today. I'm very glad to find that we hired 57 people across the country from something called the Employment Development Branch, and these were very special civil servants because they were street workers. They were people who were not bound, like most civil servants work in office. These people were out on the streets. Their job was to find ways to create employment for people in marginal situations. So they knew their communities well, they knew their way around the communities, and they were there to do a variety of things, help train the sponsors and everybody else that needed to know, but more importantly, to do the troubleshooting, because you couldn't match up ultimately about 37,000 newcomers with about 7,000 sponsor groups without there being problems. I mean, this is life. And so we needed people who had a little bit of authority, but also were very, very community worker oriented to go in and deal with those problems. Like, some communities got kind of put off when it turned out that this Hill Tribes refugee, actually didn't just have a wife and two sisters-in-law, but rather had a wife and a wife and a wife. And that was not something they might have been that all used to in Posthole Falls, Saskatchewan. So what do you do? How do you explain this? And we had just the greatest group of people that really got into this in amazing ways and solved a lot of those problems, worked out the accommodation. And also, sometimes it didn't work at all. So you had to find a different sponsor, or you had to take some remedial action. Having those 57 bright young lights out in the community, saved us a lot of sleepless nights, I must say.
I'm going to tell a little story that I've told many times before, and then we'll open it up to questions.
I have to tell one story. You get to tell one, I get to tell one. Go ahead.
Do you want to tell yours first?
Okay, you go first.
Okay, I'll go first. This combines logistics and employment, actually. My wife at the time was running the voluntary employment service for Operation Lifeline. And she got a call on a Friday afternoon from a guy saying, "I need a bagel baker. Do you have a bagel baker to send me?" And she came up to me and said, "What am I going to do with this guy?" And I said, "Tell him we're not going to have any bagel bakers coming from Indochina." But I said, "We'll see what we can do. Tell him we'll look into it." I contacted the people who were in charge of organizing the meeting of the sponsors with the refugees. And it turns out in the lists, the manifest that you supplied, they went through the manifest for us and they found there was a baker on board that flight that was landing that night. On Monday morning, he was working in a Jewish bakery baking bagels.
My favorite story comes from the Griesbach Barracks reception area. As I said earlier, the Health Canada people insisted that when the people arrived, they would be greeted formally, they would get a snack, and then then everybody would have a quick medical, and people would have a shower, and they would have to put their undies into a dumpster, and they'd be issued new ones. And none of us liked this idea at all, but that was the fiat that came down from the Ministry of Health. So this is going along very well, and I came into the office one morning late in January 78. No, yeah, late in January 78. And there was a communication in from a very soft-spoken, lovely man by the name of Guy Courier, who was the sort of spokesperson for the operation in Edmonton. And it just said, Malloy, if you insist on us taking their underwear again from here on in, we're going to put it in a box every day and send it to you. So I thought, being a Foreign Service officer and a trained immigration officer, I read between the lines that there was something there. So I called up Guy, and this is the story he told me. He was sound asleep the night before, 2 o'clock in the morning, Edmonton, cold outside. The phone rings. It's the military police from Griesbach. There is a huge disturbance going on in the barracks where the refugees from that day's flight were accommodated. And they didn't have an interpreter, but there was a big disturbance. There was a lot of noise, and they were really worried that something nasty was about to happen. So Guy gets up. It's around 1:30 in the morning. Gets up, gets dressed, calls an interpreter who lives halfway across town, drives to the middle of the night in Edmonton, Limerick. You've done that. Picks her up. They drive out to the base. They arrive at the base about 45 minutes after the call, and there is a hullabaloo going on, and the military police are all standing around, really confused by it. And as they go into the barracks, everybody's up, everybody's in the hall, everybody's talking, but little by little, they work their way to the epicenter of the disturbance. And there's a family in this room, several people, children, man, wife, and the wife is on the floor, and she is howling. She is just distraught. So they sort of get her up, and they pat her on the hands, and the interpreter finally gets her calmed down enough, and the story comes out. They're sort of a middle-class family, not terribly wealthy, but they had some means. And before leaving to get on the boat, they sold everything they had, and they bought a big diamond, a really big diamond, and they sewed it into one of her bras. And it survived the trip out by boat. It survived months and months in the camp. It survived the flight to Canada, but it didn't survive the excitement of arrival. And they had their medical, and they got their new clothes, and they had their snack and their dinner. And by the way, both centers told us, we have to lay on more and more hamburgers and hot dogs. They don't want anything to do with Vietnamese food when they come. They want apples, hamburgers, and hot dogs. Aside. Anyways, they arrive in Canada. She wakes up, she's just going to sleep, and all of a sudden, where is the diamond? Where is the bra? So this is conveyed to my friend Guy. And so he says, where's the underwear? Well, it's in a dumpster. They're going to incinerate it the next day. It's sitting in a huge dump. It's a 747, a big dumpster full of all sorts of stuff that had come off these poor people. And it's in the hangar. So in the middle of the night, the police won't help. So except to turn the dumpster over on its side. So they get a broom, they spread it out, and they go around with sticks and pick up all the bras. And then somebody has to go through, and eureka, eventually they find the missing diamond. So the next day, I simply called up the Ministry of Health and said, we will continue to do this, but all the undies are going to be sent to you. And they said, well, perhaps you could just have them wash their clothes when they first get them. So that was how we changed the policy.
Okay, we're going to open up, but I'm going to tell an underwear story, a short one. We sponsored 3 girls, and I took them down to, I think it was still Simpsons at the time, to get them underwear, because though people gave lots of clothes, the undergarments weren't there. And I took them down, and we were having the hardest time getting them to choose underwear. And I couldn't figure out how long does it take to go buy some underwear? Until the store clerk came up to me and said, I think you better go for a walk for 15, 20 minutes and come back, and then it'll all be settled. which I did, and it was settled. They just couldn't buy underwear with me standing around. Okay, let's open it up to questions. There's 2 mics. People can line up at the mics.
Mike, I have a question for you. You spoke about the quality of the civil service, which made this movement possible. It was their capacity for independent thinking, their can-do attitude, and their ability to solve problems independently. Should another Indo-Chinese movement start tomorrow, do we have the civil service that can respond in the same manner?
The answer to that's not in my little book here. I think one of the things that we're seeing with the way the total immigration program has been being configured these days, where actually talking to people is the exception rather than the rule, and most of the processing is being done in huge processing centers. I really have questions about whether there'll be an immigration foreign service in 5 years' time. And when you dumb down the system so that you get yes, no, yes, no, yes, no decisions as you go along, you don't have room for the kind of discretionary decision making that used to be the norm. And more to the point, you don't develop a body of young men and women who actually become older young men and women and mature men and women who are spending big chunks of their lives out in faraway places, not just doing their jobs, but learning about the cultures and learning about how to operate in those cultures and all the intercultural skills that are needed. The one thing that really made this work, and it came apart not long after that, the Canadian Employment and Immigration Commission was not only a big organization, but it was an organization that had everything that we needed under one minister and one deputy minister, so that there were no seams in the process. The visa offices abroad, the reception centers, the immigration offices, the funding mechanisms to support immigration programs, and the manpower centers where the government assisted people, all reported to the same minister and the same deputy minister. So there was when we wanted something done, we could send ideas up to the minister or the deputy minister, and when they agreed, the whole system recognized the orders from the same center of authority. Shortly thereafter, you recall, during Mr. Trudeau's attempt to reconfigure the Foreign Service, the external part of the Canadian government, they took the Immigration Foreign Service out of the Immigration Department and put it into External Affairs because it looked nice there. But when that happened, I thought to myself, we would never be able to do the same thing as well working across 2 departments. And we saw that in particular. One of the real failures of the program was our inability to get to move the tuberculosis cases rapidly, and that was because there was a different minister with a different set of priorities and a different set of officials giving them instructions, and we really failed on that. We brought in 1,000 in those 2 years, but at that time we probably had 3,000 or 4,000 backed up in camps abroad, and there was a seam between us and the people setting the medical criteria, and so that was one real example of if we'd had that authority with our minister, given that the Americans were moving people with suspected tuberculosis quickly, and the Australians, who are much more paranoid about these things, and we're moving them quickly. The medical science was there to render someone non-communicative in terms of not being able to spread the bacillus. You could do that in about 2 weeks. The person still had TB, but it was not communicable. So it was safe to put them on an airplane, and it was safe to get them into treatment in Canada. But I attribute that problem that we had to the fact that we weren't all in the same house.
Tom Danton from Winnipeg. I'm glad this question came up because something similar occurred to me, and has through the day, and I'm particularly thinking of your review of the history this morning, and even going back a little further than that. We had people who were really heroic during the Second World War who put their necks on the line to rescue Jews out of Europe. And I'm thinking of people like Raoul Wallenberg, who became an honorary Canadian citizen posthumously. And in your account this morning, I saw a lot of that. I saw the immigration people overseas acting kind of like, well, the Scarlet Pimpernel, or for younger people, James Bond. And I think that's wonderful. And I could see the impetus coming from the department and from the people that were employed over there, and people like you, Mike. I can see that. But what I'm wondering today, I don't see that. I see in this movement today, I see the moral, the balance in the moral authority equation having shifted more to the private sector that's trying to initiate this stuff. And I see in the fact that there are so many refusals happening overseas of people that we've sponsored, like for every 2 that arrive, there's 1 being refused overseas. And I'm just wondering if that spirit of, well, the Scarlet Pimpernel or James Bond spirit has evaporated from the department.
Can I add to that? That same question. I think the tone gets set in part by the top and in part by who you hire. It's a combination. And if you don't have the right tone at the top, then you don't hire independent thinking, initiating people who think through problems. And so they go hand in hand. You have to have the administrative skills and the experience, and you have to have somebody who trusts the administration to delegate them responsibility. That's my own impression from studies. I wasn't in the civil service, so I don't know directly.
Well, I don't like to comment too much on what's going on now, but I think it's really important that if we look at that time, to look at a couple of things. First of all, in passing that special regulation, the government communicated something very powerful to the visa officers. Really empowering, This is your target, boys and girls. Go get it. The second thing was the tone of leadership that we got from the top, from the very top. There was no doubt that the whole government was behind this. There was no, and with the other thing, those weekly communications from the minister sent powerful signals, and the signals weren't always in the text. They weren't always in the words of the text, but rather that the minister at the top was committed. The cabinet was behind him, and you have no idea how empowering that is to a frontline officer to know that you are implementing the will of the government, and that will is clear and it's strong. Third thing and I think we'll hear more of this in the next panel. A lot of people think, well, you should hem civil servants in and give them narrow things to do. The reason our program worked better than anybody else's, and I'm prepared to stand up and say that on everything except that one medical issue, was that our people were empowered. They had enormous discretion. They were expected to use their noggins, and they were expected to solve problems. And, if you found fragments of families, you were expected to put them back together. You were expected to scoop up the entire family, not leave grandma behind. So that they were, I think you take any good group of reasonably well-educated young Canadians and give them the leadership like that from the top and a clear set of direction, they'll do it. They did it in the 2 world wars. We see time and time again. There's that way of operating that's weirdly Canadian, where you get this odd blend of individual initiative and extreme cooperation between the people doing the work. And we saw that across the whole piece with Indochina. And I think when you have a government whose main signal is we don't trust the civil servants, and that we are going to continually reduce areas of discretion, and we don't want advice, we don't want analysis, and which is certainly the case today, you grow a different kind of civil servant. You grow a civil servant who is there to take orders and not to think. And that's the kind of civil servants we find in all sorts of countries around the world, but it's not the kind of civil servants we need in a democracy like ours, where we are all thinking people, and where we do best when we're all thinking along the same, when we're all using our independent analysis and working things out among us. So I think our civil service is in real danger right now. There's a generation now of young officers, say now 8 years into their service. There's a generation of them who think the job of a civil service is simply to implement orders without question. Well, where have we heard that sort of thing before?
Ron has given the right of way to a female.
I'm Betty Butterworth, and I'm going to be speaking on a panel that Naomi is convening on Saturday, but I just wanted to echo the same thoughts because I worked in the provincial government at the time, and although the government at that time chose not to have any part in choosing the immigrants that came into Ontario, there was an extensive settlement and language training program. And Naomi asked me, I did a handout for Saturday because I can't talk for that long, but Naomi asked me what were the challenges. And I had been talking to some ex-colleagues, and I said, the challenge, it was more daily frustrations, but there really weren't what I would call challenges, because when you're a civil servant, the challenges are if you don't have support from the leadership, and at that time the government had made a major commitment to this movement. If you have management that are not risk takers and don't allow their staff to take risks when they need to make decisions. And if you have staff that you work with, colleagues who are not knowledgeable about what they're doing and don't have a commitment to what they're doing. And none of those three things applied at the time that I worked in the Ontario government in immigrant services. But since that time, almost all of the infrastructure that Ontario had has disappeared completely. That happened in the 90s, slowly over a period of time. And it means that if there were a similar thing happening today, and even if the government so desired to make that sort of commitment, the infrastructure just isn't there. The people aren't there. There's no corporate memory. There seems to be more value put on people doing jobs that they don't know anything about. We came out of the field and were hired because of that. But nowadays, that's not really the case. So I just wanted to echo what you're saying about and my experience of the federal employees at the same time was just what you're saying, and that was mainly in the settlement area, and also even at the municipal level. People they were knowledgeable, they had a commitment, and that commitment went from the top right down to the frontline staff.
Thank you, Betty. Ron?
Well, Howard and Mike, thank you very much for a fascinating discussion and a bit of history brought forward. I do want to ask both of you, and I invite Howard to tell a story if he wants, about public relations strategy, and specifically the National Citizens Coalition. I remember vividly after the glory days of July 1979 when the program was announced and it began to roll out. And then the ads started to come from the National Citizens Coalition. And this was not an insignificant group, headed by a very prominent conservative, Colin Brown, in London, Ontario. Subsequently became the first employer of a fellow called Stephen Harper. And it has many supporters from across the country. And so when the ads came, fed and fueled by a fellow called Kim Abbott, who had been a career officer within the Immigration Service, There were worries among large members of the constituency, particularly what has become now known as the Conservative base. Those ads continued for the month of August and were very damaging to the government, and were beginning to turn public opinion around, because in addition to putting out a newsletter, we also read polls. And immigration is never 75, 80%. It's always down around 50, 60%. But when you see it dip below 50%, you begin to worry. And part of this had been fed by the campaign, the very effective negative campaign led by the National Citizens Coalition. But then in September, it stopped. Do you have any inkling as to why that occurred and what was behind that?
That's a leading question.
I'll invite either of you.
Shall I answer?
You go ahead.
Ron is referring to, I was going to save the story for tomorrow, but I'll tell it today. The organizations, a number of them who are behind private sponsorship in Toronto, got together, led by Operation Lifeline, and in fact led then by Dr. Joseph Wong, who is a doctor who is very involved in refugee sponsorship. And he and I, after the meeting, we were just fun. We didn't know what to do, but Dr. Wong made a few calls, and he came up to me. He said, "We got a meeting set up for 7 a.m. tomorrow morning with one of the supporters, financial supporters of the National Citizens Coalition. We're going to have a breakfast downtown in a hotel. Just show up." So I show up at 7 a.m., and the two of us are meeting with this very wealthy man who is one of the donors to the NCC. And we tell him our story. And we finish breakfast at 8:30. He says, "Don't worry, I'll take care of it." He phones us at noon and says they won't publish any more ads. What he had done is phone 15 of his fellow donors who supported the National Citizens Coalition. They were fiscal conservatives, and said essentially to Colin Brown, you stay out of refugee and immigration issues, or we cut off not only our support, but we'll contact a lot more people who will cut off their support if you enter this area again. And that was, we called it Operation Intellectual Kneecapping, and it worked. And they were silent thereafter.
Great story. Thanks, Howard.
Yes.
John Wheeler from Winnipeg, formerly with MCC, Mennonite Central Committee. My concern follows a little bit what was just said. In fact, I think it's a very good introduction. Now, I don't imagine this particular forum here at this moment is one that is going to be grappling particularly with how we can change the policy of the government. But I think we should, I would like to hear what you think the steps might be, or steps that could lead to a change of culture in the thinking of the people who control immigration, all the way from the top. Because as we just heard, the negative threatened. But there's also the positive, which he reinforced. And so we're at a juncture where we tend almost to take for granted that, you know, that's the situation now, and we're not quite sure whether that can change. It can change overnight, really. If really there's an effort put forth to change the direction of their thinking, whatever it takes. But I'd like to hear from you what you think might be ways of shifting that thinking up there.
I'll let you take this one.
After you, Alphonse.
Do you want me to?
That's a.
You want to answer that first?
Okay. I don't know that that's. I don't particularly. I think, you know, that's a question for a whole another conference, and I'll give you a very short answer, because I live in Ottawa and I observe it very, very closely, And I've got lots of links into 3 of the departments that are affected by the current thinking. What is needed is another general election. That'll change it. That's all I've got to say about that.
I'd like to give another side of that. We blame it all on the government, and certainly I think there's a good sense of responsibility. When you go to do research now in the immigration library, there isn't a library. You find they've packaged it up and boxed it up and sent it to a warehouse in Quebec. The dumbing down of the government is very serious, and it's in all fields, especially in science, it's very bad. But there's another side to it, which is the civil society side. I think we haven't done enough critical self-examination of our own role in it. In particular, if you do the scholarship on it, you understand that what rose up in the 80s was the convention refugee situation. We have one more question, and so I'm going to put this question to you since you're coming to the microphone next. The convention refugee situation is about convention refugees who have a well-founded fear of persecution. And since the 80s and since the Singh case, that has become the predominant discourse about refugees. It's a very costly program. It affects relatively small numbers of refugees as opposed to the big numbers you take in the humanitarian programs. And we had an excellent, a really superb lecture Tuesday night, and there's an annual Howard Edelman lecture at York University, and we had a superb colleague come in from UBC who gave a superb analysis of this one case on exceptionalism. But the tendency is to then say, how do you deal with all the government initiatives to water down the convention status, surround it, and prevent it from being used? But there's no attention paid to the larger concerns about why they're doing that, and no attention to say, how do we educate the public? This occurred particularly with the Minister Kenny, who was seen to be an enemy, persona non grata among refugee support groups, but who is a thinker, believe it or not. He does think, he does innovate, and there was no attempt to communicate to him that there are other possibilities. And there began to be a discourse divide between the refugee support community and people in government. And we have a responsibility in civil society to do analysis, to understand their concerns, and to communicate about their concerns as well as our own, and to come up with ideas that get around and surround both of us. So I think we also have a responsibility. And that's what I think is what responsible government is. It isn't only the leadership, it isn't only democracy, it isn't only the superb civil service. It is a responsible civil society that feeds idea and communicates with government. You're going to have the last word, because we'll probably be unable to answer your question.
Don't worry, you will have the last word. My name is Udo Jans. I work with the High Commissioner for Refugees in New York, and really want to say thank you for bringing all the memories back up, because there are some very powerful images that we heard today, and your personal involvement adds to that. As a non-Canadian, I can say things that you probably would be too shy to say. For an international civil servant, if that's what we are, I can say, if ever I was in a situation where I needed help, I needed to look at Canada. Because Canada had a quality in the staff that perhaps was the linkage that you referred to civil society, which was something that I don't know quite how to describe, but there was a gung-ho spirit that the immigration officers had, as much as civil society actors had, who worked behind the scenes to create the private sponsorships here to take people out, so that in every situation where I worked, and I worked in all of those situations that we've seen on the map, I needed the telephone numbers of the immigration officer whom I could call when I really needed to get a person out of a troubled situation, whether it was a camp, whether it was a new arrival, whether it was a medical case, whether it was a serious political case that could have repercussions in the country of asylum. And I always knew if I call that immigration officer from the Canadian embassy or the mission, something would happen and I could get a person like that out in the most non-bureaucratic way possible. So the discretionary element that you talked about this morning, for me, encapsulates that as long as it is interpreted in that sort of positive spirit, a constructive spirit, with the willingness to bend the rules to the extent possible to make it ultimately happen. I'm not sure whether we can recreate that today. I would wish it would still be visible rather than really the opposite, a straitjacketing syndrome that I see in sticking to rules and regulations, not just here, but globally. But I think it's that sort of spirit that I would love to see rekindled in other situations that are just as demanding today as they were then, that hopefully will ultimately lead again to such a quantum leap of a decision like the one that you described this morning to us.
Thank you very much, Yuri. I don't think we need to comment on that. I think we're going to take a break and return in 15 minutes, if we can. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mike.
Thank you.